Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Green Left podcast. I'm Riley Breen, and I'm currently pleased to be here in the Green Left office for once on the beautiful Gadigal country in Sydney. And I'm joined by Isaac Nellist.
Hey everyone, it's great to have Riley here in person. We've been hanging out. We've just been at the Palestine rally yesterday, so it's good to not be talking over Zoom for once and actually see you face to face in person.
And today we're going to be talking about the recently announced ceasefire deal between Palestine and Israel. And of course, that's also happening in the context of Trump's inauguration, which is due to happen midday in US time today.
Yeah, I think Australia time, it's like something like the middle of the night, tomorrow morning or something like that. But yeah, it's very much imminent and on people's minds. But yeah, I think like the ceasefire, it's like this is the kind of the big news of the last weekend. And I mean, it was the big talking point at all the rallies on the weekend that just took place. We went to the rally here in Gadigal country, and there's a lot to talk about, I think, in terms of what it means, what could potentially happen next. But obviously we can't kind of foresee the future. But I think a good starting point is that, I mean, this is what the Australia-Palestine Advocacy Network said, that the ceasefire announcement was a glimmer of hope. And I think we can look at the positive side of this, and also the more cynical side of where things will actually go. And I think it is a massive victory that we've won this ceasefire. Obviously, the protests every week have been calling for ceasefire, and it's a victory not only of the international solidarity movement, which has obviously put pressure on, but a massive victory for the resistance within Palestine that haven't been able to fight off the most powerful, one of the most powerful militaries in the world, backed by the US and all the Western countries, including Australia, and have achieved this ceasefire. I guess the thing is whether Israel is actually going to stick to it, which they've got a history of not sticking to ceasefire deals and continuing attacks.
Yeah, when I first heard the announcement, my initial reaction was, it might be a bit cynical, but I'll believe it when I see it. Honestly, we can only see how the next couple of weeks turn out, and how much Israel holds up its end, whether it does it all, whether it just uses an opportunity to regroup and then press the attack later on. But certainly it's at least a reprieve for the Palestinian people, something worth celebrating for sure. Yeah, my only worry, I guess, is that I think a lot of people, maybe I'm wrong, but hopefully I'm wrong, but I do worry that people are going to see this news, people who aren't necessarily switched on as, people who would listen to this podcast, or, the people who just generally watch SBS or ABC, and think, oh, great, it's over. I don't have to think about it anymore. That's something as a movement we really can't afford to happen, because it is far from over. There is still so much we need to push for, so much more we need to talk about. Even if this ceasefire holds, there's just even just the rebuilding and all that, and we'll talk about all that.
Yeah, I think it's been a commonly kind of repeated phrase throughout this period, the past 15 months, 16 months, of that this didn't start on October 7, which was obviously a response to more Zionist or pro-Israel arguments that this was started by Hamas or something. But obviously we know that this has been ongoing for decades, the occupation of Palestine, and that this latest genocide is only kind of the latest escalation, if you like, of what's been called a slow genocide that's been going on for that whole period. And I think there has been the urgent pressing thing in the movement is been to end the genocide that's happening now, and I think that this ceasefire could represent that, or it could not, depending on what happens next. But just because this genocide is, this escalated element of the genocide is over, doesn't mean that the occupation's over, doesn't mean that the apartheid system in Israel is over. And there's still all of those battles to win, let alone things like rebuilding, getting a health system, an education system, actual kind of political autonomy and decision making for people in Gaza and obviously in the West Bank and occupied Palestine generally. I guess I just wanted to kind of briefly go through what the actual agreement is. So, yeah, as you said, a few days ago, the deal was announced, but it wasn't until the 18th of January where the Israeli government actually approved the ceasefire in its parliament, and they had a 6-hour-long cabinet meeting. So there's figures within Israel's government who are very much against the ceasefire, and so there was a lot of kind of back and forth about whether they would actually even agree to it. So the ceasefire actually started on January 19. It started hours late because there was some mix-up with the names that were given for the hostages that are being exchanged. And even within that 3-hour window, I think it was, between when the ceasefire was meant to begin and when the ceasefire actually began, Israel was continuing to attack people in Palestine and killed at least about 20 people. And in the days between the announcement of the deal and the ceasefire actually beginning, more than 200 people were killed Palestinians were killed by Israel as well. So, you can see that they're really pushing it right to the last minute, and that, brings up those suspicions of whether they will continue. But the deal is in phases. So the first phase of the deal is kind of what we're really talking about at the moment, which is Hamas releasing 33 Israeli hostages in exchange for a few things: for Israeli forces to begin withdrawing from parts of Gaza, and as well as hundreds of Palestinian prisoners who have been in Israeli jails being freed. So that's one thing that's being talked about a lot, is this kind of hostage thing, where the Zionist media or capitalist corporate media will talk about this is all about freeing the hostages, and that's why Israel has to continue its bombardment, when it's been very clear from the start that is not the case.
Yeah, well, it's worth noting that, almost immediately after October 7th, in fact, the whole reason for Hamas taking hostages in the first place was so that they could secure themselves against, this brutal attack that they knew would be coming. And you can see again and again, they were trying to negotiate a hostage. In fact, I can't remember the specifics, but I think quite famously there was the situation where the actual Hamas negotiator was assassinated on his way to Israel to negotiate a hostage exchange. So Israel obviously they were not interested in exchanging hostage until they were in the position that they're at, which I suspect now is they're probably a little bit war exhausted. They've depleted their reserves of ammunition and maybe the reserves of IDF conscripts and so on. They probably just want to regroup more than anything. But that's only speculation on my part, of course.
Yeah, there's a lot of speculation right now about why has the deal been agreed to now? Now, some people are pointing to the Trump factor, saying that Trump was coming in and he did it himself. He called Netanyahu and said, "Do a ceasefire," blah blah blah. And I think I don't think that's correct. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of things going on in the background that could be influenced by a new presidency, and I think there's elements of Trump wanting to pull back from the supporting Israel's attacks on Gaza and supporting Ukraine to refocus on China. But that's not, the main reason for this ceasefire. There's also interesting articles talking about there's ramping up pressure within Israel. There's been opposition to the war within Israel that's kind of continued to go up, in particular since the Lebanon ceasefire. Obviously, there's still large chunks of Israeli society who want to continue. There's been protests within Israel against the ceasefire deal, and particularly they're against the release of these Palestinian prisoners. And it's worth pointing out there's thousands of Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails who haven't been charged with anything. They haven't committed any crime. They've just been picked out and taken and put in jail. And they're the kind of real hostages that we should be talking about. We just wanted to kind of talk about, what this past, year and a half has been, with some of the stats of the killing of Palestinians that have happened. So Riley, I don't know if you had the stats there in front of you on the number of deaths in the past few months.
Yeah, so the Gazan, I've got the stats here. The Gazan Health Ministry reported on January 12th that Israel had killed 46,565 Palestinians. But really, that's actually just the kind of tip of the iceberg in terms of casualties, because, you know, those are the casualties we see on, say, our Instagram feeds and so on, where we see the bombings and the direct deaths from munitions, bombs, etc. But what we don't often see and what it's harder to wrap our heads around, I think it just, you know, as a consequence of how the human mind works, is actually the indirect deaths, which is much more. So the Lancet journal, which is a famous medical journal, estimated on January 9th last year that the figure for traumatic injury mortality, quote unquote, was closer to 64,260 deaths. And that's just for the period of October 7th, 23 to June 30th of last year. It also estimated that last year the access to medical supplies and treatment and disease... Sorry, I'll start that again. It also estimated that last year that the true death toll was likely far higher, more than 200,000, if deaths from starvation, lack of access to medical supplies and treatment, and diseases are accounted for. So, of course, you know, as I said, you know, we see and we can immediately connect with the horrific deaths that are, you know, we can take a video of and sympathise with. But what we can't see so much, and what takes an even greater toll, is, you know, if there's no hospitals, no schools, no sewerage treatment, no clean drinking water, no infrastructure, you know, there's just rampant disease, cholera, you know, all sorts of viral and bacterial diseases that get into the water supplies. Giving birth without proper medical treatment makes it much riskier to do so, both for the mother and for the child. Just all sorts of stuff like that is much harder to see, but actually takes a much greater toll on a society. And so it's harder to estimate that, of course, but that's the estimation from the Lancet.
Yeah, and that's going to be a huge part of the next, you know, period of what we should campaign for, is those things. Like, we've seen images from Gaza, everything's completely flattened, rubble, like as far as the eye can see. And part of what is going to be needed, if this ceasefire holds in particular, is rebuilding that infrastructure so that, you know, people can access medical treatment and support, and obviously things as well like education, as you mentioned. Like, you know, if you're a school-aged kid in Gaza, you haven't been able to go to school for over a year and a half. It's like, well, that's going to have long-term ramifications for so many people. And there's a few stats going around of how long it's going to take to rebuild Gaza and get, you know, society kind of functioning again. And it's hard to, you know, put a figure on it, but like, it's going to be something we have to keep focusing on, because, you know, we can't just leave this in the hands of Israel or the US to be in charge of this, because, you know, obviously they're not to be trusted. There's one thing, part of the deal is that aid trucks, a lot of aid is being sent in. I think it's 650 trucks a day going in, which is going to be a massive relief.
Now, this is something that I hadn't quite had a chance to find out about it, so maybe you can answer this both for myself and for listeners. Whether or not both the Israeli government itself, but also, you know, there were elements of people within Israel that were just organising on their own to block aid trucks, whether or not that's kind of dissipated, whether or not there's been any major obstacles for that aid getting into Gaza.
Well, yeah, that's been a big story over the past few months, has been when aid has been sent, which has been limited, obviously, and not enough has been sent. As you said, there's been protests, there's been far-right kind of groups like blocking any trucks from coming in, and obviously the Israeli government hasn't been doing much to stop that happening. I think with this formal kind of agreement, I think the trucks are getting through. I guess one concern is that are Israeli businesses going to, you know, be profiting from the aid coming through? If you raise money to send whatever, you know, clothes or bedding or books or whatever you organise in kind of a fundraising situation here in Australia, and you send that over to Gaza, to get there, it's going to go through Israel, and, you know,
who's taking a cut?
Yeah, so there's that as well, which is it's kind of depressing to think about. But I just wanted to play a quick clip. This is from the rally yesterday in Gadigal Country, Sydney. of people celebrating the end, celebrating the ceasefire and hoping for, peace and an end to this genocide. In Gadigal country, Sydney, the first rally after the announcement of the proposed ceasefire deal. So we're going to go around and ask some of the people here who have been coming out every week what the ceasefire deals means for them and why they want to keep protesting for Palestine every week here in Gadigal country.
Well, my reaction to the ceasefire deal is the same as any sane person, is that we don't trust Israel as far as we can throw it. It's violated every single ceasefire deal it's ever been signatory to. However, we welcome it in terms of at least a reprieve for the people of Gaza. At least they'll get aid. At least there'll be some kind of sense of respite. Why do we have to keep coming out here? Because this is a drop in the ocean. We will be fighting. We will be struggling. We will be dismantling the Zionist machine until Palestine is totally free, 100% from the river to the sea. There's no other way. There's no shortcuts.
Look, the first thing to say, it's an enormous relief. Thank God that we can stop the bombs and there's some relief if it lasts. The big worry is whether it lasts. Past ceasefires have been violated by Israel. They use a pretext to keep doing their atrocities. So we have to get the world to exert the pressure that they can, and government. That's the first thing to say. There's an enormous reconstruction job. The medical team's food has to get in. So it's a very difficult time, and the casualties, the medical aid that's needed, is a very, very difficult period. But the hope is that we can sustain this in the longer term. It's still not clear.
Yeah, because we know that Israel wouldn't abide by the international rules, and even the slightest chance that they can get, they will try to get away with, whatever they've been given, like a blank check to do whatever they want, and they're getting away with impunity. And so going out here on the streets to show that we still oppose our government's support for Israel, arming Israel. We want our government to be held accountable, and we want to appear that we're still standing in solidarity with Palestine, even though there's so-called imminent ceasefire going on. We want everyone to be held accountable.
Well, one of the typical features of this is that the Israeli leadership didn't want to end it, and especially the ultra-right nationalists. I think they're threatening to resign, and so the difficulty, of course, internally in Israel is to put enough pressure on the Israeli government. That'll depend a lot on what Trump does now as he comes in.
Well, I think we have to be confident that it's the mass movement, the international, incredibly powerful movement that has forced Israel to concede on this ceasefire. It's 15 months, and we've been saying ceasefire now for every single rally here in Gadigal country. And it's 67 weeks that we've rallied here. And internationally, there's a massive movement. We've forced Zionist Israel to give us this partial win, but we have to be ever vigilant. We're not going to walk away. We're going to keep mobilizing, because we know that Israel's still got Palestine territory in its sights, and until they release every single Palestinian hostage, which is around 10,000, 11,000 people, and get out of Palestinian territory and stop bombing and rebuild Gaza and rebuild the West Bank and allow the return of Palestinian refugees, of which there's 4 million across the world, then we're going to keep rallying.
Look, it's very important for the worldwide protest to continue. For one thing, there's the West Bank. We're not paying enough attention to the West Bank. There's something like 1,000 people have been killed since October the 27th in the West Bank. And the oppression and the dispossessions, the brutality is on a very large scale continuing in the West Bank, which is what they really care about. The intention is probably to annex the whole of the West Bank. So we have to keep pushing there, not just for Gaza. And so worldwide pressure and the demonstrations have to be continued in full strength. It's not over. And the fact that there's a ceasefire doesn't mean that we should stop our political activism.
I'll also say, just, you know, this is my first time attending a rally in Sydney. Certainly from a Perth perspective, it's much bigger and livelier than I often get to see. But I also just found both the speakers, you know, were very, very good and well spoken in terms of, you know, both celebrating the ceasefire, but also, you know, doing what we're talking about now, which is being very cautious about that celebration and understanding and making the point that, you know, this is far from over. But it was, you know, no matter the limitations of this agreement, it was still fantastic to see basically a dance party afterwards from the attendees. And yeah, like despite the limitations of this agreement and the possible things that could go wrong in the future and all the work that's still ahead of us, we need a moment to celebrate. I mean, you know, especially the Palestinian Arab community, I think needs this time needs to celebrate this win while we've got it. And yeah, it was actually quite beautiful to see.
Yeah, definitely. It was, you know, a very emotional moment at the end of the rally. I think, you know, a lot of groups and different organizations have been putting out statements about, you know, about the ceasefire, about, you know, the victory, but also the need to keep organizing, keep protesting. I know in Sydney, the protests are going to continue weekly. I'm sure different groups around the country are thinking about how they're going to kind of move to this next stage of the movement. One group based out of South Africa is the South African Boycott, Divestment and Sanction Coalition, which said it joins with the people of Gaza in the hope that this will provide respite from over 15 months of the genocidal Israeli regime's terror against the Palestinian people. And it has said the steadfastness of the people of Gaza represents one of the most astonishing examples of collective courage in history. I think that's something we've got to remember, is the victory really does belong to the people of Gaza who have been resisting this from the start. I think, you know, there's a tendency with a lot of media coverage, particularly from the corporate media, to kind of ignore the actual Palestinian people, the Palestinian resistance, as, you know, passive kind of figures who have just, you know, been experiencing this or been kind of trying to survive this. But really they have been playing a huge role in surviving in and of itself is one thing, but then actually resisting and keeping a kind of live resistance going to the genocide this whole time as well, which has given us here as like solidarity activists something to kind of cling to and not just feel like we're just isolated within our own kind of context, but also connected to the international solidarity movement around the world and the actual resistance within Gaza as well. It's interesting looking as well at the reaction from the Zionist organizations within Australia.
Yeah, I saw recently the Australian Jewish Association, which is, for those who don't know, they're basically people who decided that the Council of Australian Jewry wasn't quite right-wing and not quite fascist enough, so they went and formed their own little club. They also recently made a post about a long-time Green Left writer and contributor, Jim McElroy, who was standing at an airport with a copy of Green Left that said, you know, keep fighting for Palestine. And how would you feel when you saw this? And of course, if I saw that, geez, I'd think, good on ya. But that's been shared widely both among the left and the right in terms of, you know, right-wing Zionists being outraged by it and left-wingers being, you know, cheering it on. They said the AJA said it had mixed feelings about the deal, and they praised Donald Trump for his role in securing it. Now, Donald Trump only gets inaugurated today. I don't know exactly what role he's had. It also expressed a hardline opposition to the creation of a Palestinian state, which is, that's actually such a watered down concession, in terms of what we want out of the movement. That even the Australian government has now voted in favour of the creation of a Palestinian state. Now, of course, that can be a tiny little flag on the map, 2 kilometres wide on each side, and that's still a state of Israel. Whereas, we want one democratic state from the river to the sea, of course. But for them, even that minor little thing would bring, quote unquote, death and suffering. And on the other side of Jewish opinion, Jews for Palestine WA, who we did a great interview with a couple of weeks back with Janet Parker. They said the ceasefire deal was long overdue, and that it remains sceptical about Israel's commitment to upholding its part of the deal, which we all are, and that it is concerned that the suffocating blockade and dire conditions on the ground created by Israel means the suffering of Palestinians will continue.
Yeah, it's I think the reaction from the Zionist organizations has been very revealing. They don't seem very happy that the hostages have been released. They actually seem upset that, it's kind of revealed that their real plan has been the genocide, ethnic cleansing of Palestine, clearing out the Palestinian people, and not, it's revealed that this kind of concern for the hostages has been just a front for their real motivations. And that's been very much outlined here. I guess to move on to, we don't really know everything that's been going on in the background in terms of where this agreement has come from. Who's involved. There's big players in the region like Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Qatar. Obviously, the US having a huge say over things. But we do know that all these countries, they're not going to be making things better just for the sake of it because they've suddenly decided to be nice, but they're going to be, putting things in place to benefit themselves and their ruling classes and strengthen their position within the Middle East, including accessing resources or military control of various areas, etc. And as I mentioned before, there could be, domestic angles. The genocide has been very unpopular in most countries have had, consistent protests going on. And as I said earlier, there's also the impact of potentially the US trying to turn its focus towards China. I mean, you can't supply arms to everywhere all at once as much as they probably wish they could.
I'm sure Raytheon and Boeing wish they could just pay more and more for it.
Yeah, definitely. It is quite disturbing, though. The reports that this deal that has been agreed to has been the same deal that's been on offer for a year or so. And Hamas has been pretty much happy to agree to this ceasefire deal this whole time. But, whether it's Netanyahu and the Israeli government or US influence or whoever has been basically rejecting it and not interested in actually ending the genocide. So it's pretty horrifying to think of all the, people who have been killed in that time, all the destruction that could have been avoided. And as you said before, Hamas offered a kind of a ceasefire deal pretty much immediately when Israel started its bombardment, wanting to exchange the hostages they'd taken on October 7 for the prisoners. And that's what's happening now. But it's worth seeing this ceasefire as the kind of first step, a really important first step to end the genocide. And I think a lot of the time we kind of think, the protests aren't having an impact, blah, blah, blah. We haven't been able to stop the genocide prior to this point. But it's worth keeping in mind that, without the massive international movement, without the resistance within Palestine, this could have been a lot worse. And it's, it's hard to imagine how things could be worse, but, it could be.
For sure. I often have kind of newer activists they'll come to a couple of protests quite enthusiastic, and then after some period of time, whether it's a couple of weeks or a month or 4 months or whatever, they'll start to say, oh, what's the point of these protests and so on. Especially, in a place like Perth, but even in a place like Sydney, anywhere in Australia, where we're fairly small compared to a lot of other countries. It can feel a bit like we're just shouting against the wall. But I try and explain it this way, that it's kind of like the people in Palestine are waging a direct armed struggle, and they are the front line of this fight. They are the vanguard almost of the fight, and we are kind of like, to use kind of military terminology, it's like all of us around the rest of the world, especially in the Imperial Core, we are kind of like the flank of the fight. Where we're on the edges of it, but we're still a very important part of it. Without the flank, the centre can't hold. So that's how I like to try and explain it to these people. That it's, it may not feel like we're doing much in our little cities, in our little areas, but actually it contributes to this whole battle that we can't see. And yeah, as you said, like, I can't imagine that the ceasefire would even be happening right now without both the efforts of, armed resistance fighters in Palestine itself, but also the struggles and efforts of activists all over the world.
Yeah, 100%. And like, thinking about the impact here is like, it's pretty like frustrating to see like Albanese and Wong and Labor say, yes, like a ceasefire, that's what we've been fighting for, like that's what we've been pushing for from the beginning. When, as we've reported many times on this podcast, Labor has been, fully backing the genocide, providing both political and economic support, but also providing arms. And, there's a huge back and forth arms trade between Australia and Israel. And to see them kind of claim, it was our kind of diplomatic work that achieved this ceasefire is so, frustrating. And that's kind of where, like, I guess we can focus on next is, okay, you said you're all for this ceasefire. Now let's actually see you support, what's needed next, reconstruction efforts, etc., etc.
Yeah, exactly. And what are you going to do? Are you going to, are you still going to make any steps towards sanctioning Israel? Are you still going to try and push them to end apartheid? Are you still, if Netanyahu turns up in Australia, are you going to arrest him like the ICC demands? That's all things that we can only wait and see. I'm a bit skeptical about whether they'll do any of those things, but that's exactly why we still need to keep pushing for it.
Yeah, the International Court of Justice and International Criminal Court cases that have been going are still there and haven't been dealt with. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there as well. The South African BDS coalition that we mentioned earlier said that without massive pressure, the ceasefire may constitute a continuation of a less visible form of genocide that Israel and the US will hope to provoke less global outrage, boycotts, and sanctions. So that's definitely a risk, if there's like less of an immediate kind of bombing campaign that you can see very clearly, as you put before, like they can be more subtly kind of doing things as they have been for decades and continuing that kind of slow genocide and have less attention on it, less outrage. It kind of feels like there's been a kind of a big shift in world politics, particularly around the Middle East as well, with what's happened in Syria, the kind of defeat of Hezbollah in Lebanon, the kind of normalization or between like the kind of Gulf countries with the US, like Saudi Arabia and UAE and Qatar and etc. And then, Iran kind of not supporting Palestine not supporting Hamas to a massive extent either. And it does, and with, we don't know exactly how things are going to play out with the Trump presidency, but it does feel like there's a bit of a shift going on.
I don't think even Trump knows how things are going to play out with the Trump presidency.
Obviously, this is kind of the very early days that we're trying to get a bit of a glimpse of what's happening, but things are going to continue developing. What the APAN president Nasser Mashni said was that a ceasefire is not justice. He said it's a fleeting reprieve that will never undo the profound pain caused by Israel's genocide, nor will it alone prevent the next wave of bloodshed, and justice means liberation. So yeah, the thing about the profound pain, like, there's nothing that's going to undo the way that Palestinian people, particularly in Gaza, but all around the world, the impact this will have had on them as people, kind of emotionally, politically, personally. There's nothing that can undo that. The only thing we can do is work towards, liberation, and that's through justice and actually holding, Israel accountable and building, rebuilding society, Palestinian society. The APAN also pointed out that, this genocide couldn't have happened without the support of the US, Australia, Western countries, European countries, and it was $26 billion provided by the US to Israel since October 7.
Just obscene.
Yeah, it's crazy. So basically what APAN is calling for, and what a lot of the various groups are calling for, is we still need to cut ties with Israel, particularly military ties, but also impose sanctions and hold the Israeli officials and government and other entities that have been involved accountable for committing a genocide. Just because you've stopped it doesn't mean all is forgiven. And an element of that is also there's Australian citizens who have gone to Israel to join the IDF to participate in the genocide as well. The APAN also said Australia must commit to addressing the root causes of Israel's genocide, which is the illegal occupation and apartheid. And that needs to be something that the movement keeps up the pressure on. For people who, I guess, are newer to the movement or weren't kind of around prior to this current kind of genocide, there was, particularly in Sydney, quite a good Palestine solidarity movement already, which, responded to, various Israeli attacks. I mean, there's been, ongoing attacks and wars are going back. And just because we have a ceasefire doesn't mean that's going to stop. It actually means we need to continue putting on the pressure. As we've mentioned, reconstruction efforts, accountability, prosecution of Israeli officials, and dismantling the apartheid regime to have a truly free Palestine, whatever that looks like, with Palestinian people having self-determination and determining how they want to, electing their own kind of leadership and having their own society. So that's all kind of the next steps. There's going to be a whole lot of shit, basically, in between getting to that stage, figuring out how that all works, and trying to make sure it's not just a kind of a cover that we've all kind of believed. As you said, a lot of people will think of, there's a ceasefire, that means I don't have to pay attention anymore, or that means that it's all over, but that's really not the case.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I think the reality is that not so much activists, but the majority of people who kind of watch passively, it's painful to think about it. It is. I can understand why people don't want to engage with this. I think they should anyway. I think it's a moral imperative to engage anyway, but I still understand why people don't want to. Yeah, and so as soon as you have an opportunity, that means, great, it's over. I can think about all the other problems in my life, and don't have to think about the problems happening over there. I can see why people would be tempted to take that. But I hope by and large that people it doesn't just drift out of people's consciousness altogether.
Yeah, and we'll obviously continue writing updates and articles and analysis within the pages of Green Left, so make sure to check out the Green Left website. And the easiest way to make sure you actually see all the articles that we put up is to become a supporter, which starts from only $5 a month to get the online subscription. And we also will be putting all the the rallies that are continuing, different various events up on the Green Left calendar, which is greenleft.org.au/events. So is there anything else you wanted to add before we wrap up, Riley?
Nope, just that it's on a completely other topic. It's been a pleasure to spend time with the Green Left team here in Sydney, and to actually be able to do this in person.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, we'll be back to Zoom recordings.
I'm being banished way back to the isolated colony of Bulu, Perth.
Yeah, we're sending you back to the Texas of Australia.
The Texas of Australia, the heart of the fossil fuel Death Star.
Yeah, so we'll be back to the Zoom recordings, but it's been great to talk to you in person, and hopefully we'll get to do another one of these in person again at some point. Just before we wrap up, I'd just like to mention again, if you liked this podcast, the best thing you can do is become a Green Left supporter at greenleft.org.au/support. It also makes a massive difference if you share, comment on this, help boost through the algorithms. The next big protest around the country is the Invasion Day protest. So there's going to be pretty much a rally in every major city on the January 26th, and it's really important that these are huge rallies. We've seen, this kind of pushback from the right, particularly led by Peter Dutton and the coalition against, the wins that we've had for First Nations rights. They're trying to put back, Australia Day, citizenship ceremonies and all this kind of shit. They're arguing against, welcome to country and these kinds of things. And those are important, and we need to fight to protect those. But there's also, there's very real physical things like the incarceration rates, children still being removed from their homes at actually a far greater rate than the stolen generation. Deaths in custody are continuing, and there's a whole host of issues that, neither Labor or the coalition are even talking about, let alone putting any kind of plan to address. So, as well as other massive one is land rights and the complete destruction of country, land and sea country by mining companies that's going on. So make sure you head to your Invasion Day rally. We've got a link in the description that has all the events, and if there's any that we have missed, please send us a message or a comment or an email, and we can put that onto our list. So that's going to be the next podcast. We'll be talking a bit about those rallies and other news that's going on. So, and one final thing is that Green Left are upgrading our website. We, basically need to do this upgrades for the website to continue. But, as a kind of grassroots, people-powered organization, we really need to raise money to actually afford to do it. And it's going to cost about $80,000. So we've started, a fundraising campaign. If you have spare change lying around, it can make a huge difference if you donate. So head to greenleft.org.au/donate. And so we can keep this project going. That makes a massive difference. But thanks for listening. And great to chat to you, Riley.
All right. I'll see you.